After we've chosen our presentation aids, there are some considerations that we need to account for when we're using the presentation aids. And the first, and maybe most important, is that we want to be strategic about our use of the presentation aids. Remember that we're using these to accomplish certain goals. We want to emphasize things that are especially important for the audience to remember. We're using the presentation aids to better explain ideas that would be harder to explain if we were just using verbal words. And also, if we think of presentation aids as another piece of supporting evidence, which they really are, then we see them in connection with the claims that we're using them to support. So we want to be able to incorporate them at the right moment so that they either emphasize the memorability of that information, give a clear representation of that information, and or make sure that we're supporting the claim that we want to support. Another thing that's important to consider is that we want to have the aids ready to go before we start the speech. And this means getting everything set up. It means making sure that it's accessible to us when we need to present the aid. We're not going to want to lay everything out for our audience and have the aids become a distraction, because what happens is when they're all laid out, the audience focuses on those instead of on us as speakers. But we do want them accessible so that we can bring them to the audience's attention at the right moment. Another thing to consider is that presentation aids are another piece of supporting information. They're not decorations. They don't simply communicate the message on their own. They can't just sit there and be interpreted. We want them to support certain claims. That's why we're using them. So to make sure we treat them in that way. The example video that I provide about the use of PowerPoint, I think, demonstrates this point really well. That video talks about using PowerPoint only after laying out the entire speech, because the important thing is in the message and the construction of that message. It's not in the use of PowerPoint. PowerPoint can supplement and at times improve the speech, but it can't carry the speech. If you don't have a good speech constructed, it doesn't matter how good your PowerPoint or whatever presentation program you're using is. Another consideration is that we want to explain and interpret our presentation aids for the audience. Presentation aids, as another piece of supporting information, are open to interpretation, or they may be hard to interpret. So we want to help out the audience, and we want to make sure that they get the interpretation that we want them to get. So make sure you point things out, explain them, connect them to the claims that you're making. I've got a few example speeches that I think are really great at using presentation aids. And the first one is about filter bubbles that things like Facebook and Google are using to customize people's experience of the internet. And the speaker is talking about how these filter bubbles are actually excluding certain things from our Facebook feed, or are tailoring our Google search results. And as you can imagine, this is a very technical process and might be hard to explain without the aid of a visual. And the author, or the speaker, does an awesome job of using these visuals, different screenshots, changing images that show how these filters are working. And so I think that's a great instance of how to use presentation aids very strategically and to perform a certain function of explaining something that's very technical. Another example is a video that contains actually 3 different speeches, and they all use presentation aids very effectively. The first speaker uses the human brain and is very particular in pointing out things and using it to demonstrate the point that he's making. So it's very clear for the audience, and he actually uses that to engage the audience very well. Another example is from Bill Gates, who brings in some mosquitoes to demonstrate a point about the importance of thinking about malaria as a disease that needs to be addressed. So he brings in these mosquitoes to help underscore the point that this can relate to just about everybody. And then the final example from that video may be the best, and it demonstrates how visuals can express ideas in ways that verbal or written words aren't so effective at. So to talk about how much sugar children are getting, the speaker wheels in this wheelbarrow of sugar and lays it all out there for the audience to see, and it makes this huge impact that just talking about the size of that pile of sugar wouldn't do. And then the final example is the speaker from earlier in this semester who was talking about pain. And I said at the time that his use of the torch on the arm and the feather on the arm were great examples of actually using a presentation aid very effectively and very strategically. Some final considerations when we're using presentation aids. Make sure you talk to your audience, not to the presentation aid. When we do a really good job of constructing presentation aids, they can also distract us. So we need to be able to focus on our audience. It's okay to look at our presentation aid on occasion and to point out things on that presentation aid, but don't forget that you have an audience there. Make sure most of your attention is focused on the audience and not looking at your presentation aid, because it's harder to hear when you're turned away, and you lose a connection with your audience if you're not engaging them. Obviously, make sure that everyone can see it. This is particularly important if it's a bigger room, but even smaller rooms can be hard if there's an angle or if people are sitting behind each other. Make sure that they all can see it. Obviously, avoid passing around the object. If you have a physical object, this becomes a huge distraction, even for the instructor or the people who are evaluating your speech, because what happens is the person who has the object is looking at the object. They're not listening to you. The person next to them, who's next in line, is waiting for it. They're waiting to see when the person's going to hand it to them. The person farther back is looking, well, where is that presentation aid? I wonder when it's coming to me. And all this time, you're losing the connection with the audience, and they're not listening to what you have to say. They're just thinking about when they're going to get this presentation aid. And then finally, because presentation aids are another form of supporting evidence, we need to be able to make sure that we cite our sources that are applicable for this presentation aid. So if you got that information on that presentation aid from a source, make sure you cite that source.